In 1996, a quiet Arkansas town became the site of a crime so horrific it shook the nation. William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah were targeted by two men who came into their home posing as law enforcement officers. What followed was a cold-blooded execution that left their bodies dumped in a nearby bayou. The killers, Chevy Kehoe and Daniel Lewis Lee, were driven by a dangerous ideology, one that would lead them to destroy a family for the sake of hate. But what led them to target the Muellers? And what was the dark plan they had in mind? This is the chilling story of the Mueller family murders. Stay with me, because the truth behind this crime is more twisted than you could ever imagine. Chevy Kehoe's path to infamy began in the Pacific Northwest, where he was born and raised. From a young age, Kehoe was exposed to a variety of radical and extremist views, but it was during his teenage years that his beliefs solidified. Raised in a household that had its share of instability, Kehoe found himself drawn to a group of individuals who shared his growing disdain for the government and the changing face of America. By the early 1990s, Kehoe was fully immersed in the ideology of white supremacy, believing that the only way for the white race to survive and prosper was to rid the world of those who didn't share his beliefs. Kehoe didn't just adopt these ideas passively, he took action, joining the Aryan People's Republic, a violent white supremacist group. He believed deeply in the idea of creating a white ethno-state, one where people of color, Jews, and anyone he deemed an enemy would have no place. This radical ideology would soon define his actions in the years to come as he grew more and more committed to his mission. Kehoe's criminal activities, which had started small with petty thefts, escalated quickly as he turned to illegal weapons deals, armed robbery, and other violent acts in service of his twisted cause. By the time he crossed paths with Daniel Lewis Lee, he was no longer just a petty criminal. He was a dangerous man driven by a violent vision of the world. Daniel Lewis Lee, born in 1973 in Oklahoma, had a life marked by turmoil and instability. Raised in a broken home, Lee's early years were a mix of neglect and hardship, and by his late teens he found himself entangled in the same toxic world of white supremacy that had captured Kehoe's attention. Lee had been searching for meaning and belonging, and the hate-fueled rhetoric of neo-Nazi groups seemed to offer the answers he was looking for. Like Kehoe, Lee became convinced that America's problems could only be solved by a violent revolution, one that would usher in a white-dominated society and eliminate anyone who didn't fit the mold. As he immersed himself deeper into this world, Lee found a sense of purpose in the violent words and promises of racial purification. Lee's criminal record, though less extensive than Kehoe's, reflected his growing commitment to his extremist beliefs. He was arrested multiple times for theft and other minor offenses, but these were just a prelude to the horrors he would eventually participate in. His bond with Kehoe was immediate and intense. Both men saw the world through the same dark lens and believed that they were destined to play a central role in the coming race war that would tear America apart. Their partnership was a deadly one, fueled by a shared vision of racial conflict and a violent agenda. Together, they plotted to rob a series of targets in order to fund their movement, to gather weapons, and to prepare for the so-called holy war they believed was coming. For them, violence wasn't just a means to an end. It was the end itself. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as warriors, fighting for a cause greater than themselves. The Mueller family led a life that many would consider ideal. Quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by the natural beauty of rural Arkansas. In the small, tight-knit town of Tilly, they were just another family in a close community, content in their simple routines. William Frederick Mueller, a 52-year-old gun dealer, ran a successful business that supplied firearms and equipment to local hunters and sports enthusiasts. He was respected by those who knew him, seen as a hard-working man providing for his family. His reputation was built on years of honest work, and his business thrived in the tranquil isolation of the Arkansas hills. Nancy Ann Mueller, William's second wife, was a 28-year-old woman devoted to her family. She had a nurturing spirit, and her love for her husband and daughter was evident in every part of their lives. She had met William years earlier, and their bond had only strengthened with time. Together, they had a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Powell, who was only 8 years old at the time. Sarah was a bright, curious child who loved to explore the woods surrounding their home, fascinated by the animals she would find and the adventures the forests held. Her innocent wonder for the world around her made her a joy to be around, always full of energy, with a smile that could light up a room. The Muellers lived on a quiet road, far removed from the hustle of city life. Their home, a modest house nestled within a wooded area, offered them the peace and serenity they cherished. It wasn't just a house. It was their safe haven, where they could escape the world's chaos and simply enjoy each other's company. In this little corner of Arkansas, surrounded by the rolling hills and trees, the Muellers had built a life that seemed untouched by the troubles that plagued the rest of the world. Their days were simple. William spent long hours at work, ensuring that his business continued to grow and provide for his family. Nancy spent her time at home caring for Sarah and managing the daily tasks of running a household. The family would often spend their evenings together, enjoying the quiet that came with living in such isolation. But despite the calmness of their lives, they were about to be swept into a storm they couldn't have possibly foreseen, a storm that would shatter their peace forever. The small town of Tilly, where the Muellers called home, may have appeared to be a perfect place to live. It was a town where neighbors helped one another and strangers were rare. But it was also a town that existed in the shadows of a growing, darker reality, one that was lurking just outside the reach of the community. While the Muellers lived quietly, isolated from most forms of danger, others were drawn to this remote corner of the world with a different purpose. Kehoe and Lee's plan wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of weeks, if not months, of careful plotting, each step designed to maximize their chances of success. For Chivy Kehoe, a member of the Aryan People's Republic, the mission was more than just about money. It was about fueling a dangerous ideology, one that sought to promote white supremacy at all costs. The Mueller family, with their small gun business in rural Arkansas, became the perfect targets in Kehoe's mind. William Mueller wasn't just any average man. He was a 52-year-old gun dealer with an extensive collection of firearms, ammunition, and cash. For Kehoe and Lee, getting their hands on these items was crucial to funding their extremist agenda. Lee, who had joined Kehoe in his radical beliefs, saw this as their way of striking a blow for their cause. The idea was simple: rob the family, take their firearms and money, and disappear into the night. But as they formulated their plan, they knew they couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. This was no ordinary robbery. It was a cold, calculated attack on a family whose only crime was existing in a way that Kehoe and Lee despised. They needed a way to ensure that the Muellers wouldn't put up a fight, and that meant creating a situation where they felt completely helpless. Lee and Kehoe knew the key to achieving that was posing as law enforcement officers. They gathered fake uniforms, badges, and law enforcement equipment that would allow them to gain access to the Mueller home without suspicion. Their hope was that by pretending to be part of the police, they could quickly and easily subdue the family, making it impossible for them to fight back or alert anyone to what was happening. The planning didn't stop there. Kehoe, a meticulous planner, had scouted the area around the Mueller residence, familiarizing himself with the layout of the land. They chose a day when the family would be home, ensuring that they could catch them off guard. They even planned their route to avoid detection, mapping out the safest way to enter the house without drawing attention. Lee, who had already shown his willingness to commit extreme acts in the name of their ideology, was fully on board with the plan. They knew that the Muellers were not just ordinary citizens to them. They were a symbol of everything they hated. This wasn't just about robbery, it was about sending a message, and the Muellers were the unfortunate victims of that message. The more they prepared, the more they hardened themselves to the brutality they were about to unleash. Every step of the plan had been carefully crafted, from the way they would handle the family when they entered the house to the exact location of where the guns and money were stored. They had already worked out how they would intimidate the family, how they would separate the parents from the child, and how they would extract every bit of information they needed without leaving a trace. It was a chilling display of efficiency and coldness, but in their minds, it was just another step toward fulfilling their twisted cause. For them, the end justified the means. They knew that the Muellers wouldn't survive the night. That was the plan. The goal wasn't just theft, it was a statement. Every action taken, from choosing the target to the execution of the crime, had been shaped by their radical beliefs, and the cruelty they were about to inflict was the unfortunate consequence of those beliefs. The reality of what they were about to do was almost unfathomable. They had put everything in place: timing, disguise, weaponry, even the approach, and all that was left was to carry out the crime. The Muellers, who had no idea what was coming, would be powerless to stop what was about to unfold. Kehoe and Lee had carefully constructed their plan, not leaving a single detail to chance, because they were convinced that their mission was just. And so, the two men set out toward the Mueller home, their hearts cold with the belief that this would bring them one step closer to the violent and warped vision they sought to achieve. Little did the Muellers know the peaceful evening they were about to spend together would be their last. What should have been an ordinary night in rural Arkansas would soon be forever marked by an act of cruelty, a tragedy that would shake the nation to its core. Kehoe and Lee's plan had been set into motion, and there was no turning back. On the morning of January 11, 1996, the quiet, rural town of Tilly, Arkansas, was about to be rocked by an act of violence that would leave the local community shattered and the country stunned. William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah were just going about their everyday lives, unaware that two men were driving toward their home with a deadly plan in mind. G.V. Kehoe and Daniel Lewis Lee had been preparing for this day for months. Both men were deeply involved in the white supremacist movement, and their mission was clear. They intended to rob the Muellers, a family that sold firearms, and fund their extremist activities through violence. Kehoe and Lee had spent considerable time surveilling the Muellers' home. They knew that William, a gun dealer, would have firearms and cash stashed somewhere on the property. But what they didn't know was how much their ruthless actions would ultimately tear apart the community and ignite a national conversation about white supremacist violence. The Muellers weren't just random victims. This was no spur-of-the-moment crime. Kehoe and Lee had carefully planned every detail, and they knew exactly how they were going to carry out the crime. That cold January morning, G.V. Kehoe and Daniel Lewis Lee arrived at the Mueller home, dressed in tactical gear and carrying firearms. They knocked on the door, pretending to be law enforcement officers. When William opened the door, he was immediately overpowered by the two men, who forced their way inside. The family, caught off guard and unable to comprehend what was happening, quickly found themselves in the grips of a nightmare. At gunpoint, William was restrained and ordered to cooperate. They demanded that he hand over any money, firearms, and ammunition he had in the house. Nancy and Sarah, both terrified, were forced into the living room, where they were also bound by the men. The brutality of the situation was immediately clear. The Muellers weren't just being robbed, they were being targeted, specifically because of their connection to firearms. As the two men looted the house, they turned their focus to 8-year-old Sarah. In a chilling moment, Sarah was interrogated. Her terrified cries filled the air as they demanded she tell them where her parents kept the family's firearms and cash. The cruel intensity of the situation left no room for mercy. Sarah, still a child, had no choice but to comply, her words trembling as she pointed to the hidden areas of the home. There was no compassion from her captors, only a cold demand for information. Then, in an instant, things escalated. Kehoe and Lee had come prepared. They used stun guns to incapacitate William, shocking him into submission. It wasn't enough to just control him, they wanted to break him, to render him helpless. The sound of the stun guns reverberated through the house as they moved from one victim to the next. The electric shock of the weapons left the family vulnerable, struggling to stay conscious and fight back. The pain was unimaginable, and yet it was only the beginning of their torment. Once the family was rendered helpless, Kehoe and Lee turned their attention to the final step, execution. They grabbed duct tape and plastic bags, wrapping the victims in the sticky tape and sealing their fates. There was no remorse, no hesitation in their actions, just cold, calculated violence. Nancy was the first to succumb to the suffocating grip of the plastic bag. Her screams fell silent as the life was choked out of her. William, her husband, soon followed. The two adults, struggling to breathe as the bags tightened around their faces, were mercilessly silenced. But the true horror didn't end there. Young Sarah, the innocent 8-year-old girl, was forced to witness the murder of her parents. In a final, agonizing moment, she too was suffocated, her life taken without a second thought. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve the violent fate that awaited her, but in the eyes of Kehoe and Lee, she was just another victim in their deranged plan. The family was wiped out, their lives extinguished in a brutal and calculated manner. And as quickly as it had begun, the horror was over. But Kehoe and Lee weren't done. The murder was just the first step in a larger scheme. They began gathering up the firearms, cash, and any valuables they could find. The Mueller's home had been ransacked, and yet Kehoe and Lee were still determined to leave no trace of their crime. They loaded their stolen goods into their vehicle, leaving behind only the remnants of their violent action. But there was one thing they didn't account for: the bodies. With no remorse and no fear of the consequences, Kehoe and Lee decided to dispose of the Mueller family's bodies in the Illinois bayou. They chose a remote location, believing that the isolation of the bayou would make it impossible for authorities to connect the crime to them. They dumped the bodies without a second glance, thinking that their twisted plan would go unnoticed and that the world would forget about the Muellers. But as they drove away, the consequences of their actions began to unfold. Despite their careful efforts to cover their tracks, Kehoe and Lee had underestimated one crucial factor: the power of forensic investigation. The authorities weren't going to let this crime go unsolved. The investigation into the deaths of the Mueller family would soon reveal the shocking truth. Kehoe and Lee's desperate attempt to erase their tracks would lead to their eventual downfall. The discovery of the Mueller family's bodies would set the stage for an investigation unlike any other, unraveling a disturbing tale that seemed too horrific to be true. It all began innocently enough, with friends and relatives of the Mueller family growing concerned after they hadn't heard from William, Nancy, and young Sarah in several days. The family, who were known for their quiet, peaceful life in the small town of Tilly, Arkansas, had simply disappeared. When their home was found abandoned, the mystery deepened. There were no signs of a struggle, no clear clues to explain where they might have gone. The small town was soon buzzing with fear and speculation. As the days passed, the investigation intensified. The authorities quickly organized search teams, combing through the surrounding woods, riverbanks, and areas where the family might have traveled. But their search would take a sinister turn on June 22, 1996, when a local fisherman, casting his line into Lake Dardanelle, noticed something unusual floating in the water. At first, he thought it was just debris, but as he got closer, the unmistakable outline of human bodies became clear. Stunned and horrified, the fisherman immediately called the police. When law enforcement arrived, it didn't take long for them to realize that what they had found were the bodies of the Mueller family. The bodies had been discarded carelessly, left in the water to sink and be hidden from sight. All three of them, William, Nancy, and Sarah, had been murdered in cold blood. Their bodies bore marks that suggested they had been tortured before their lives were taken, adding an extra layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. But the circumstances of their deaths were more puzzling than anyone could have imagined. There were no clear motives at first, and it seemed impossible that a family as seemingly unremarkable as the Muellers would become victims of such a brutal act. As investigators meticulously searched the scene, the picture began to take shape. The family's home had been ransacked. Valuables were missing, including firearms and large amounts of cash. At first, it looked like a botched robbery, but something about the nature of the crime didn't sit right with the investigators. The brutality, the calculated nature of the murders. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. The evidence pointed to something much darker, something more methodical. But what? Then came the break in the case that would change everything. An anonymous tip came in to law enforcement, an informant who had a connection to a man named Chivy Kehoe. Kehoe was no stranger to the authorities. He had a history of violent criminal activity, and his ties to extremist groups were well known. But what was most chilling about this tip was the connection it made between Kehoe and the murder of the Mueller family. The tipster had overheard conversations that suggested Kehoe and his partner Daniel Lewis Lee were involved in something far more dangerous than just a random crime spree. This was a conspiracy driven by a sickening ideology: white supremacy. As the investigation dug deeper into Kehoe's past, the authorities uncovered a disturbing trail that seemed to lead directly to the Muellers. Kehoe and Lee weren't simply looking for money. They were targeting the Muellers because they were gun dealers. In their warped view, anyone involved in the sale of firearms to the wrong people was an enemy, someone who needed to be eliminated. They saw the Muellers as obstacles in their twisted mission to further their violent white supremacist agenda. The Muellers, who were just trying to make a living, became symbols in a larger, more dangerous plan that they could never have anticipated. The investigators soon discovered that the firearms stolen from the Mueller home were a direct link to Kehoe and Lee. Forensic evidence, ballistics reports, and serial number traces pointed to the two men. But it wasn't just the stolen goods that led the authorities to them. Surveillance footage from nearby stores, phone records, and bank transactions all provided damning evidence. Kehoe and Lee had been planning the crime for weeks, even months, leading up to the murders. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they thought they could get away with it. The breakthrough in the case came when Kehoe's wife, shocked by the growing attention surrounding the murders, came forward. She revealed the chilling details of what had been discussed in their home. According to her, Kehoe and Lee had meticulously planned every aspect of the crime, from how they would enter the Mueller home, to how they would subdue the family, to the exact way they would dispose of the bodies to ensure they couldn't be identified. Their twisted belief in their superiority, their hatred, was what drove them to commit such an unspeakable act. Kehoe and Lee had believed they were justified. They had convinced themselves that the Muellers were part of a larger conspiracy, that their violent actions were necessary in the fight to create a world dominated by their extremist views. They wanted to send a message of fear, of intimidation, of absolute control. And to them, the lives of the Muellers meant nothing in comparison to the message they thought they were sending. Authorities quickly began to trace the firearms, reaching out to gun shops, pawn shops, and other dealers in the region. It wasn't long before the trail led them to Chivy Kehoe. Kehoe was no stranger to law enforcement. He had been on their radar for his known connections to white supremacist groups and his past criminal activity, but it was his association with the stolen weapons that would eventually lead to his downfall. In June 1997, a major breakthrough came. Kehoe was pulled over during a traffic stop in Washington state, and during the search of his vehicle, officers found evidence directly linking him to the Muellers' murder. This discovery set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to his arrest and the unraveling of a far-reaching conspiracy. As Kehoe was taken into custody, the FBI launched a manhunt for his accomplice, Daniel Lewis Lee. Lee had managed to evade capture for months, but law enforcement was closing in. His arrest would be the final piece of the puzzle, and in March 1998, Lee was finally caught in a remote area of the Pacific Northwest. He was taken into custody without incident, and both men were now facing charges for the murder of the Mueller family. Kehoe and Lee's background came under intense scrutiny during the investigation. It soon became clear that the two men were not just criminals. They were part of a broader extremist ideology. Both had ties to white supremacist groups, and their involvement in the crime seemed to stem from a twisted sense of duty to their beliefs. The motive for the murders appeared to be tied to a plan to fund their white supremacist activities that were aimed at furthering their vision of a violent, all-white society. This discovery shocked the community and added a chilling layer to the case. Law enforcement uncovered letters and correspondence between Kehoe and other white supremacists, as well as evidence that pointed to their plans to attack other targets in their mission to create a racially pure society. Kehoe and Lee had not just killed the Mueller family for money, they had murdered them in cold blood as part of a larger scheme. The trial of Chivy Kehoe and Daniel Lewis Lee was one of the most high-profile cases in recent memory, drawing attention from all over the country. The prosecution's case against the two men was built around their disturbing motivations and the overwhelming evidence that linked them directly to the murders. In addition to the forensic evidence, the prosecution presented testimony from those who had known the men and from experts on white supremacy. They painted a picture of two men who were willing to kill innocent people in cold blood for the sake of their racist beliefs. During the trial, the court heard about the planning and execution of the murders in detail. Prosecutors showed how Kehoe and Lee had meticulously prepared for the crime, acquiring police raid gear to make their attack look like a law enforcement operation. They described the chilling moments when Kehoe and Lee entered the Mueller home posing as officers and overpowering the family. The prosecution made it clear that the men's actions were not the result of a spontaneous decision, but rather a calculated and deliberate act of violence. As the case unfolded, the defense attempted to argue that the crime had not been premeditated and that Kehoe and Lee were not fully responsible for their actions. They painted the picture of two men who had been influenced by external factors, including the influence of others in the white supremacist movement. They tried to argue that the murders were somehow the result of their beliefs, rather than a direct act of cold-blooded violence. But despite these arguments, the evidence was overwhelming. Kehoe's history of violent crime and his ties to extremist groups painted a clear picture of a man who was willing to do anything in service of his ideology. Lee likewise had been outspoken about his extremist beliefs and had left behind evidence in the form of letters and correspondence detailing his violent ambitions. The jury saw through the defense's claims and found both men guilty of the murders of William, Nancy, and Sarah Mueller. In the end, the sentences were handed down. Chevy Kehoe, who had played a significant role in planning and executing the murders, was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was a man who had already shown a complete disregard for human life, and his role in the deaths of the Muellers confirmed that he was a dangerous individual who needed to be removed from society forever. The fate of Daniel Lewis Lee was even more severe. Lee had been the more vocal of the two, openly discussing his hatred for non-white people and his desire to carry out violent acts in service of his racist beliefs. He had been convicted of all charges related to the murders, and he was sentenced to death. Despite numerous appeals and attempts to delay his execution, Daniel Lewis Lee was executed by lethal injection on July 14, 2020, on the death row of California, Illinois. On July 26, 2020, his execution marked a significant moment in the history of federal executions, as it was the first in 17 years. While the trials and convictions provided a sense of justice for the Mueller family and the community of Tilly, the broader implications of the case were far-reaching. The murders had highlighted a growing problem in the United States, the threat posed by domestic terrorism and extremist groups. The case served as a chilling reminder of the dangers of hate-filled ideologies and the lengths to which some individuals would go to further their cause. The brutal murder of the Mueller family reverberated far beyond the quiet rural town of Tilly, Arkansas. The crime wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a chilling reminder of the dangerous rise of white supremacy in America. What had happened to the Muellers was not just a personal tragedy for their family and the community, but a warning sign to the nation that hate-fueled violence was becoming all too real. In the aftermath of the murders, authorities began to recognize the growing threat of extremist ideologies. Kehoe and Lee's connections to white supremacist groups like the Aryan People's Republic and the Covenant, Sword, and Arm of the Lord made it clear that this was not an isolated incident. Their actions were part of a larger, disturbing movement that had been building for years, fueled by a dangerous belief in racial purity and the rejection of diversity. The Mueller family had been targeted because they were seen as enemies by those who sought to create a white ethno-state. The Mueller's firearms business, an innocuous family venture, had unwittingly become a symbol of something much darker. This case became a catalyst for a nationwide conversation about domestic terrorism. The tragic reality was that extremist groups like those involved in the Mueller murders were operating in the shadows, but their influence was growing. Law enforcement had been largely focused on international terrorism, but the brutality of this crime forced authorities to turn their attention inward. Federal agencies, including the FBI and ATF, began to realize they were facing an internal enemy, one that was just as dangerous, if not more so, than any foreign threat. The investigation into Kehoe and Lee led to new strategies for countering white supremacist violence. In the years following the murders, agencies began to prioritize the monitoring of hate groups, conducting undercover operations, and improving intelligence sharing to prevent future tragedies. This marked a shift in law enforcement priorities, away from traditional criminal activities and toward a growing recognition that hate-driven crimes posed a serious threat to national security. The federal government also started to increase collaboration with local authorities, hoping to break the chain of violence before it could escalate further. For the residents of Tilly, the crime was an unbearable shock. What had once been a peaceful, small-town community was now scarred by a dark chapter in its history. The town that had felt safe, far from the world's violence, was now the epicenter of a national story that would forever alter its reputation. People who once never thought twice about their neighbors now found themselves wondering about the hidden darkness that could lie beneath the surface of seemingly normal individuals. The psychological toll on Tilly was profound. Local residents, who had known the Muellers and seen their peaceful lives shattered, struggled to make sense of the brutality that had been inflicted upon them. Fear and uncertainty took hold, and it became difficult for anyone to feel safe again. But the repercussions went far beyond the small town. The murder of the Mueller family was a wake-up call for the entire nation. It served as a sobering reminder that domestic terrorism was not a future threat. It was already here. The case cast a spotlight on the growing, often overlooked, rise of right-wing extremism. It forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about how deep-rooted hate could be, even in communities that appeared calm and idyllic on the outside. This wasn't the first time white supremacist violence had raised its ugly head, but the scale of the crime, the cold, calculated nature of it, and the motivations behind it brought this issue into sharper focus. The Mueller family's story was a tragic example of how ideological hate could target anyone, anywhere. As details of the crime spread, it became clear that the Muellers had been nothing more than victims of a larger, hateful agenda. They were an ordinary family, one that ran a small business and lived their lives with no connection to the forces that would ultimately destroy them, but they were targeted because of who they were, because of their perceived association with the very things that Kehoe and Lee wanted to destroy. For the survivors, the extended family members and friends, the impact was devastating as they struggled to cope with the brutal loss. The trial and eventual execution of Daniel Lee brought the issue of the death penalty back into the national conversation. His conviction was a reminder that justice had been served, but it also reignited debates about whether the death penalty was appropriate in cases like this, where hate, extremism, and ideology had fueled the violence. While some believed the execution was justified, others argued that it was a symptom of a broken system, one that did not fully address the deeper causes of extremism. For some, the idea of executing Lee, a man who had been radicalized by a hateful ideology, brought up uncomfortable questions about how America was dealing with the larger issue of homegrown terrorism. But even more pressing than the legal debates was the reminder that extremism and hate can take root anywhere, often without warning. The Mueller family murders served as a grim symbol of the lengths to which violent ideologies can push individuals. The cold execution of an innocent family was not just the work of two men. It was the manifestation of a larger, collective belief in hate. And that belief, as ugly and destructive as it was, would continue to thrive unless society confronted the forces that perpetuated it. In the years following the crime, the Mueller family story became a pivotal moment in the fight against hate-hatred violence. It forced the nation to ask critical questions. How do we protect our communities from the spread of extremist ideologies? How do we stop the next tragedy before it happens? The case revealed uncomfortable truths about the rise of far-right extremism and how unchecked hatred could fester, leading to devastation. And in the end, the legacy of the Mueller family's murder would serve as a somber reminder that vigilance and awareness were the first steps in preventing the next act of violence fueled by hate. As Tilly and the nation mourned the loss of the Muellers, the case left behind a scar that would not fade. For some, it was a tragic story of a family torn apart by evil. But for others, it was a crucial lesson in the dangers of extremism, a lesson that would stay with them for a lifetime. The murder of the Muellers may have ended, but the fight against hate and the consequences of unchecked ideology would continue for years to come. The Mueller family's story stands as a grim reminder of the lengths to which hate can push some individuals. It's a story about the tragic cost of extremism and the importance of vigilance in the fight against violence fueled by hate. We may never fully understand why a family like the Muellers, who had done no harm to anyone, was chosen as victims. But one thing is certain, the legacy of their lives and the fight for justice continues, reminding us all that even in the darkest of times, there is always the hope that truth will prevail. If you found this story chilling, leave a comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime cases that delve deep into the darkness of human nature.